This is a guest essay written by Pat Johnson, the director of Upstanders Canada, founded to mobilize non-Jewish Canadians to stand up against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
The embers of the Adas Israel Synagogue in Melbourne are still glowing, but most of the world, it is probably safe to say, has scrolled on. The attack on the synagogue is just the latest in a worldwide pandemic of anti-Semitism. But the vast majority of non-Jews just go about our day. Perhaps the main way people lull ourselves into complacency is by asserting that this isn't actually anti-Semitism, but merely a disordered reaction to overseas events. When the war in Gaza ends, we tell ourselves, so will the anti-Semitism in Australia, Canada, and everywhere else. This is direct inversion. The anti-Semitism worldwide is not caused by overseas events. Overseas events are an excuse that allow voice to domestic anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism didn't exist in the West, events in the Middle East wouldn't coincide with attacks on Jewish people and institutions. There is a bigger issue, though. A few people, political leaders like those in Australia, recognize and condemn the massive spike in Jew hatred that has happened since October 7th, 2023. Here's what's scary, though. This didn't begin on October 7th. This has been going on for more than 24 years, at a minimum. And while few people seem appropriately alarmed by what has happened in the past year, far fewer are even conscious that this has been going on for a quarter century. The current era in global anti-Semitism began on September 28, 2000, with the beginning of the Second Intifada. That was the moment when people worldwide saw the Palestinian leadership, and much of the Palestinian people, reject peace, coexistence, and the ideal of a two-state solution, and begin blowing up Israeli civilians on buses and in discos. And the world sided not with the victims, but with the perpetrators. That victim-blaming anti-Semitism was embodied, codified, scaled, and packaged for export at the Durban Conference in 2001. Ostensibly a United Nations event to combat racism, the Durban Conference morphed into the modern world's most deplorable trade show for anti-Semitic ideas and strategies. Anti-Semitism in Western Europe, the Americas, and elsewhere in the quote-unquote West began spiraling upward throughout this century. Anyone who was paying attention over the past 24 years should have known this. I worked at Hillel, the Jewish campus organization, and watched this at a slow boil for 2 decades, erupting at moments of Mideast conflict into a cauldron of anti-Semitic chaos on North American campuses. And no, throwing boulders through Jewish campus windows is not anti-Zionism. Terrorizing Jewish kids because they believe in their people's right to national self-determination is not political expression. Those of us who were immersed in this stuff thought that we were just not communicating effectively. If people knew, surely they would care, we assured ourselves. It wasn't that. They know. A lot of people have known for years. But since October 7th, no one with any consciousness can deny that anti-Semitism is as much a part of our civilization as economic inequality and climate change. I suppose we managed to ignore those crises and get on with our lives too. Even so, a good number of ordinary people who stand up against racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and other social ills are silent on anti-Semitism. In fact, in plenty of cases, it is these very people who are perpetrating the worst of the anti-Semitism. But that is a topic for a different essay. What's that about? Why don't they care? I have a couple of theories. My main theory of anti-Semitism is that it is the perfect prejudice. Anti-Semitism is impervious to challenge and defeat because its very characteristics reinforce it. It is self-perpetuating. It is a feedback loop. Here are some examples of what I mean. Number 1, anti-Semitism assumes Jews are powerful, and you cannot be powerful and oppressed. Among the foremost tropes of anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews are powerful. This is an enduring stereotype even in societies where Jews have been the most powerless. The Nazis imputed to Jews vast powers, Even though Jews made up about 1% of the population, about the same as Jewish population in Canada today, the Nazis convinced plenty of Germans that Jews, despite their small numbers, controlled the German and global economies, were corrupting German culture and racial purity, were subverting morality, that they had single-handedly caused German defeat in the First World War, and lots more. In societies where Jews have been an even tinier, even more powerless minority, times and places where no reasonable person could believe Jews had power in any tangible, rational, or real sense, Jews have been accused of supernatural powers. Spooky woo-woo ideas of Jews as agents of dark powers have been around for centuries, and these ideas are not as dead as you might think. One need look no further than the U.S. Congress for believers in quote-unquote Jewish space lasers, or what passes for mainstream thought in much of the Middle East, for apparently credulous reporting of, quote, Zionist attack sharks. The larger point is that so-called Jewish power has been a prevailing racist trope for centuries, from the attribution of every unfortunate event to Jewish evil-doing, to the contemporary idea of Jews/Zionists pulling the strings of U.S. foreign policy. In short, anti-Semitism defeats efforts to defeat it by its very nature. We convince ourselves that anti-Semitism cannot exist because we live in an anti-Semitism culture where Jews are perceived as powerful and therefore immune from discrimination. Number 2. Anti-Semitism says Jews are rich and privileged. Hand in hand with the so-called Jewish power motif is the idea that Jews are rich and privileged. In our current culture, we lump these characteristics together with power. But this has not always been the case. In places and times where Jews have been emphatically not rich or powerful, the concept of Jews as the chosen people has driven non-Jews wacky. Today, wealth and perceived privilege are the prime standard by which we differentiate oppressor and oppressed. And since we live in an anti-Semitism culture that says Jews are rich and privileged, we automatically assign Jews the role of oppressor. Anti-Semitism is reinforced by anti-Semitism. Number 3. Anti-Semitism asserts that Jews bring it on themselves. Perhaps all forms of racism are premised on the idea that the victims bring it on themselves. But this is an absolute core pillar of anti-Semitism, that there is something inherent to Jews that brings out the worst in non-Jews, and that if Jews would just stop doing what irks non-Jews, non-Jews wouldn't have to hate and genocide them. Today's example of this approach is obvious, like if the Jewish state would just stop defending itself from Hamas, we wouldn't have to burn down synagogues in Melbourne. Anti-Semitism, therefore, is not something we need to worry about, because it is not our problem, it is theirs. If Jews would stop doing XYZ, anti-Semites wouldn't be forced to ABC them. Number 4. Anti-Semitism asserts that Jews are hypersensitive and carry a quote-unquote persecution complex. This is foundational to anti-Semitism and non-Jews' ability to ignore it. The more that Jews say they are experiencing anti-Semitism, the more it reinforces the anti-Semitic idea that Jews see anti-Semitism everywhere, and the more we can ignore their increasingly desperate pleas for tolerance, because they always say that. Anti-Semitic ideas of a quote-unquote Jewish persecution complex allow even anti-racist people to ignore anti-Jewish racism. Number 5, the very term anti-Semitism allows bigots to absolve themselves. The prefix anti implies conscious, active hostility. And since much of today's anti-Semitism manifests not as burning synagogues, but as innate bias in the discourse, even those perpetuating anti-Semitism can deny it. People say, I am not against Jews, therefore I am not anti-Semitic. But that is not the main way anti-Semitism is manifesting right now. It's true that anti-Semitism on the left is probably more rampant than anti-Semitism on the right, but people can't see it because it doesn't look the same. Anti-Semitism on the right tends to be tiki torch-carrying kooks, overt hatred, and conspiracy theories. Anti-Semitism on the left is overwhelmingly more subtle. It is unconscious attitudes or stereotypes, preconceived notions that lead to confirmation bias. The most infuriating part of this is that all of these terms are the language of the left. This is the lingua franca of anti-racism, the terminology of critical race theory. And yet it is precisely these people, quasi-progressives, anti-racists, those who are proudly woke, who steadfastly reject the very idea that inherent biases about Jews are interfering with their worldview. As in so many cases in which a problem is overtaking a person's life, it is blatantly obvious to everyone else in their life, except the individual and their enablers. And lastly, number 6. We don't recognize anti-Semitism because we don't know what a Jew is. Despite being a non-Jew who for decades has been immersed in Jewish life, I had to ask rabbis and professors in order to construct a succinct definition of Jewish identity for a project earlier this year. If I couldn't come up with that definition off the top of my head, people who have not spent the last 30 years writing for Jewish newspapers and working for Jewish agencies probably don't stand a chance in hell of understanding the complexity of Jewish identity. As a result, far too many people satisfy themselves that, however you might define Jews, they are not a race, and as a result, I can say what I want about them, and that's not racism. In conclusion, anti-Semitism has components that are massively psychologically effed up. For example, most forms of racism reassure the perpetrator that they are better than the victim. That makes the perp feel better about themselves, which is kind of the whole point. A core characteristic of anti-Semitism is that the perpetrators think Jews think they, the Jews, are better than the perpetrator. Among the problems this evokes is that this doesn't make the perp feel better about themselves. Like many other forms of racism, misogyny, homophobia, and other biases do. It makes them feel worse, which makes them want to lash out more. So it is sort of like drinking seawater. The more anti-Semitic you are, the more you are sure the Jews are lording their superiority over you, the more you hate them, and the more anti-Semitic you become. For anti-Semites, and those with the biases I'm talking about, Jews are an out-group whose enemies think they are an in-group, who the enemy wants to make an out-group. But for people predisposed to biases toward Jews, the very nature of anti-Semitism justifies anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the perfect prejudice because anti-Semitic ideas, quote-unquote, corroborate anti-Semitism. My prejudices about Jews are correct because my prejudices about Jews say they are correct. Are you following? If not, good. Because anti-Semitism is a symptom of disordered thinking. So consider yourself mentally healthy if it doesn't make sense. For people with anti-Semitic biases, these ideas make perfect sense. That's why so few people seem to care that synagogues are burning.